we can certainly get a sense of your feeling about the exportation of chondros from Indonesia. Are there any legitimate reasons to export chondros, wild-caught chondros from Indonesia? I mean, certainly, you can make an argument for some species conservatism to better the well-being of the species. If it's a species that perhaps is endangered, and you're trying to better the species. Are there any legitimate reasons for anybody to export wild-caught chondros today?
Yeah, well, I guess the point is, why not? There's no conservation issue. Green pythons are extremely abundant and common in their natural habitats. They're going to be wiped out by deforestation long before they're wiped out by over-collection. I think it'd be very hard, given the price of the snakes, to make them go extinct through harvesting, just because it costs a lot of time to go out into the forest and look for individual declining species. To harvest the last few is actually economically doesn't make sense. So it's not a conservation or necessarily a sustainability issue, and so I don't see what the problem with it is. Indonesia obviously protected them because they want to. I don't really know, to be honest, why they've protected them. But my argument to the Indonesian government has always been, why don't you just legalise the wild export of the chondros? They export a large number of other snakes that are taken from the wild, and those trades are completely fine. So why shouldn't they do the same with chondros? And perhaps people could pay a bit more for a known locality-specific Arfak mountain snake or a known Yapen Island snake. And ideally, a lot of the proceeds from that, if there was a small conservation levy, perhaps that could go back to the communities that are actually living, coexisting side by side with these animals. And that might actually provide incentives for these people to, instead of cutting down forests, they may think, okay, I'm getting a regular income from selling wild-caught snakes. Perhaps instead of cutting it down, I'll leave it intact so that I can keep reaping the benefits from the snake trade. It's a little bit difficult in practice because chondros are only worth about $200 when they come out of Indonesia. There's precedent been set with trophy hunting and so on in Africa with rhinos and elephants and so on, where people pay $50,000 to cull a problem elephant, and a lot of those proceeds go back to the community. And slowly over time, the community realised, let's stop poaching and killing these elephants, for example, which are often a nuisance. They destroy gardens, and they can often be aggressive towards people and livestock. And so because of the benefits they were getting, they actually started protecting the elephants. And it'd be fantastic if we could implement a similar system where not only the animals are being harvested sustainably, so there was no conservation issue, but secondarily it may also protect biodiversity more broadly through habitat protection, and that obviously protects other species, and also provides the livelihood benefits for some very, very poor people living on the planet. I think the issue now is that the trade is illegal, and everybody knows that. From top to bottom, they all know that. And so animals they're shipped covertly. They're wrapped up in newspaper or little bags, and they spend weeks on boats and so on. And we saw very, very large numbers of dead chondros and other reptiles. And that's basically attributable to the poor conditions that come about through the illegal trade. It would be fantastic to legalise the trade and say, you can do this, we can provide training on how you can ensure the welfare and the cleanliness standards, hygiene, etc. for animals in your care, and how to worm wild animals properly and so on. And I think the major thing, which I touched on earlier, is then you wouldn't have the misinformation. These animals arrive as wild-caught animals in the United States, and people could therefore make an informed choice about whether they actually want a captive bred animal or a wild-caught animal. And if they do decide to take the wild-caught option, then they can implement a number of fail-safes or whatever, like quarantine, whatever you guys do with your worming and so on, all that sort of thing, to ensure that they're not going to break up the collections that are already established, and also give that specific animal the greatest chance of survival. So in theory, I despite you read the papers we write, and they might seem negative, but actually, and as though we're anti-trade, but actually, I'm all for sustainable trade. It's the misinformation with these species that is the real issue. And I'm not a big animal rights kind of person. I'm fairly down to earth. Grew up on a farm, those sort of things, and killing animals is all part of life's rich pattern. But I do think it's important to maximise, or where possible ensure, animal welfare standards. And because the trade is illegal, that's difficult to do at this stage. But if it was legalised, then perhaps we would have a better chance of getting more animals out of the wild, and actually getting them into the hands of private keepers in the US and Europe, alive instead of dead.
Well, that's a very interesting theory, because one of the things that we didn't bring up about people in the United States and perhaps Europe that purchase imported animals would be the more experienced keeper, not the new person, but the more experienced keeper that wanted to inject new bloodline into existing projects, or the fact that they are really true locality specific. They really want that kapia, or they really want that Manakwari or the biak. And now the way that these animals, the wild card animals, are imported, you don't know. You don't know really where they've come from, because everything has to be so underground, hush hush. So you make a very interesting point about legalizing the exportation of those animals. Wow.
Intriguing.
Well, we've talked about Indonesia, and we've talked about some of the smaller islands. What about Australia? Can you give us a sense of what the status of chondros in Australia is, Daniel?
Yeah, I think chondros in this country are fine. The habitats are intact, and they're well protected within several national parks. The populations are very, very large. It's hard to tell if they're the largest I've ever studied, but certainly green pythons, for me at least, are easiest to find in Australia, perhaps because I have most experience with this locality, if you will. We have three distinct populations, one in the Mackelwraith range, one in the Iron range, and others in the Kawajinachi ranges, which are coast ranges, and they're small little pockets, and each one is isolated by areas of woodland, and also woodland valleys that separate them from the larger Mackelwraith range. But green pythons are found in great numbers in all of these places, and so I think their success is guaranteed. The only thing that may change that is climatic regimes that, over the last 17,000 years, for example, 17,000 years ago was the height of the last glacial maxima, where sea levels were 180 metres below what they are today. So most of northern Australia was connected to New Guinea. It was very dry, and so rainforest, obviously, the name gives it away, it requires rain, and so it retracts back into refugia like gorges and so on, where a lot of water can be stored in pools, and rainforest can remain there, and that's where green pythons can hide out. But if those refugia are not available, then ultimately climate change, not an induced climate change obviously, but just natural cycles of climate change could wipe out green pythons. But that's not going to happen in our lifetime, certainly.
Daniel, I'm always intrigued by some of the stuff I see with the Australian keepers. If you live in Australia, can you go collect green tree pythons from the wild? Do you need a permit? Is there a process you go about it? Or if you just decide, I'd like to have a couple of green trees as a pet, maybe a breeding project, you just go and collect them on your own? Is there a process to do that in Australia?
Sure. So it's illegal to collect any wildlife in Australia, and it's technically illegal to touch a leaf on the ground, a dead leaf in a national park, or to touch roadkill or anything. The laws in this country are incredibly prohibitive and strange, in my opinion, but you can technically apply for permits to collect for scientific purposes protected wildlife, and so I've obviously had permits to study them and collect them in the past. But
Right.
and technically you should be able to, under the law, you should be able to apply for permits to harvest small numbers for commercial use. However, the Queensland government is quite averse to the commercialisation of wildlife. In my opinion, it's a somewhat backward philosophy, but there you have it, and I don't see it necessarily changing anytime soon, because obviously a few people going in and taking 100, even 1,000 snakes from some of these areas, if legal and well regulated, is not going to have any conservation impact. So I don't necessarily see what the issue is, but someone in power clearly does.
Can you, are chondros from Indonesia or from Papua New Guinea imported into Australia? Can that be done legally?
No, so Australia cannot import. It's we can import exotic birds and a number of exotic mammals. However, Australia cannot import reptiles. So it's it's not really a consistent legislation. Clearly, we have a large number of Papua New Guinean and probably Indonesian green pythons in Australia. For example, we have a large number of snakes that are and were obviously red neonates. And as you may know, Australia only has the yellow neonate form, and all of southern New Guinea, or the southern species, which is Morelia viridis, has only the yellow neonate form and not the red one. So it's quite clear that these animals have come from the northern side of the New Guinea Central Cordillera, probably from Biak, based on the ones I've seen. But the government as yet is turning a blind eye to it, which is fine. There's no issue, but it's technically illegal. But the difference between legal and illegal is just a piece of paper which can be ripped up and rewritten. So, yeah.